The perfect shot. The golden hues of the setting sun painted the sky in breathtaking shades of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the tranquil park. Emma adjusted the strap of her well-worn camera bag as she exhaled slowly, savoring the crisp autumn air. She had always loved photographing families during this time of year, the soft light, the vibrant foliage, and the way the golden hour had a way of making everything seem more magical. A few feet ahead, the Harrison family stood in a near-perfect formation, awaiting her instructions. Nathan and Lily, the parents, stood at the center, their arms comfortably draped around their two young sons, Jacob and Ethan. Baxter, their golden retriever, sat obediently at their feet, his ears perked as if he, too, understood the importance of this moment. Emma smiled, lifting her camera to her eye. "All right, everyone. Big smiles for me." The boys giggled, nudging each other playfully, while Nathan and Lily exchanged a warm, affectionate glance. It was the kind of genuine happiness that Emma loved capturing, the unguarded, unscripted moments that told a deeper story than any posed photograph ever could. She snapped a few shots, stepping to the side to adjust her angle. "Mom and Dad, lean in a little bit closer. There you go. Ethan, put your arm around your brother. Perfect. Hold that pose for me. Click. Click. Click." The camera shutter whirred rhythmically, freezing time with each press of the button. Emma took a step back, lowering the camera slightly as she studied the scene before her. There was something so effortlessly beautiful about the moment, the soft laughter, the way the sunlight danced through the leaves, the comforting presence of a family completely at ease with one another. And yet, something felt off. A faint unease settled over her, like the feeling of walking into a room and forgetting why you entered in the first place. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint right away, just a lingering sensation, a whisper at the back of her mind that told her something was out of place. She shook it off, attributing it to exhaustion. She had been working non-stop for the past few weeks, balancing wedding shoots, newborn sessions, and a slew of last-minute holiday portraits. Maybe she just needed a break. Still, as she glanced at the camera's display, her stomach twisted. She zoomed in on the most recent photo, scanning the details with careful precision. The family's smiles were still there, the golden light still painted them in its ethereal glow, but her focus was drawn elsewhere, towards something small, something she hadn't noticed before. Ethan's wrist. Her breath hitched as she squinted at the screen, her finger hovering over the display. A birthmark. It was barely noticeable at first, just a small, crescent-shaped mark on the inside of the young boy's wrist. But as she zoomed in further, her heart began to race. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the camera lens, convincing herself that it had to be a trick of the light. Maybe a smudge, or an odd shadow cast by the trees. But no. There it was again. A perfect, distinct crescent-shaped birthmark. Emma's fingers clenched around the camera. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the image, feeling an eerie wave of déjà vu wash over her. She knew this mark. It wasn't just any birthmark, it was identical to the one she had seen years ago. Identical to the one that belonged to someone she lost long ago. Her mind reeled, her thoughts tangling together in a frantic mess. It was impossible. And yet, there it was, staring back at her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to steady her breathing. Maybe it was a coincidence. After all, plenty of people had birthmarks, right? It wasn't that unusual. But deep down, she knew. Something was very, very wrong. Her stomach twisted as she lowered the camera, her gaze shifting toward Ethan, who was now giggling as Jacob whispered something in his ear. He looked so much like. No. She clenched her jaw, pushing the thought away. This was just another family session, just another job. She wasn't here to dig up ghosts. And yet, as she looked back at her camera, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. This was something else. something that could change everything. A shadow from the past. Emma's fingers tightened around the camera as she forced herself to breathe evenly. The warm glow of the setting sun now felt suffocating, its once golden embrace now replaced with an eerie weight pressing down on her chest. She blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at Ethan's wrist. The small, crescent-shaped birthmark stood out like a ghost from her past, an undeniable imprint of something, someone, she had buried deep in her memories. For a long, agonizing moment, the world around her faded. The laughter of the children became distant echoes, the crisp autumn air turned stale, and all she could hear was the rhythmic pounding of her pulse in her ears. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. And yet, here it was. Emma? Are you okay? Lily's voice snapped her back to reality, her warm brown eyes filled with concern. Emma swallowed hard, her grip on the camera slick with sweat. She forced a smile, nodding quickly. Oh. Yeah, sorry. I just thought I saw something on my lens. She wiped the camera's surface again, though she knew it was a useless gesture. The mark wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't an illusion. It was real. And she had seen it before. Do you want to take a quick break? Nathan asked, adjusting his glasses as he peered at her curiously. We don't mind. No, no, Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm good. Let's get a few more shots before we lose the light. Lily and Nathan exchanged glances but didn't press further. Instead, they turned back to their boys, who were now trying to get Baxter to sit still for another pose. Emma lifted the camera again, but her hands trembled slightly as she refocused the lens. She tried to push away the flood of memories threatening to consume her. It had been nearly 7 years since the night that changed everything. 7 years since she had lost him. Liam. The name alone sent a shiver down her spine. Liam had been more than just a name in her past. He had been her everything, her baby brother, the boy she had sworn to protect, the boy who had vanished without a trace when he was barely a year old. The police had searched for months. Amber alerts were issued, missing posters plastered across every town within a 100-mile radius. Their mother had spent years drowning in grief, blaming herself, blaming the world. Blaming Emma. Because that night, Emma had been babysitting. She had been just 13, young, but old enough to know better. Old enough to have watched him more carefully. But she hadn't. One moment, Liam was there in his crib. The next, he was gone. No forced entry. No evidence of abduction. Just, gone. And now, here she was, standing in the middle of a picturesque family session, staring at a little boy with her brother's exact birthmark. Her stomach twisted. It was impossible. But what if it wasn't? She hesitated, her gaze flicking between Ethan and his parents. They seemed normal. Happy. Loving. But then again, appearances had fooled people before. Emma inhaled sharply, pushing the thoughts away. She was spiraling, letting emotions get the best of her. There was no way this was Liam. Ethan was their son. He had a family, a home, a life. She had no right to question that. And yet. Her hands clenched around the camera as she made a decision. She needed to be sure. Forcing a cheerful tone, she lowered the camera slightly. Ethan, buddy. How old are you? Ethan grinned, holding up 6 fingers. I just turned 6 last month. Emma's breath hitched. 6. Liam would have been 7 now. Not 6. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The birthmark. The resemblance. It still didn't add up. She forced herself to smile, nodding. That's awesome. I bet you had a big birthday party, huh? Ethan giggled. Yeah. We went to the zoo. It was so cool. Mom let me feed the giraffes. Emma glanced at Lily, who smiled warmly. He's been obsessed with animals since he could crawl, she said, laughing. We figured a zoo trip was the perfect gift. Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The unease wasn't fading. If anything, it was growing. She snapped a few more photos, but her focus was elsewhere. Her mind was racing, piecing together fragments of a puzzle she hadn't even realized she had been holding onto for years. She needed answers. And there was only one way to get them. After the session wrapped up, Emma packed her gear, forcing casual conversation as they walked back toward the parking lot. She needed to see Ethan up close one last time. As they reached their cars, Lily bent down to adjust Ethan's jacket. The little boy held out his hand, tugging at the sleeve, exposing his wrist once again. Emma's pulse thundered. Without thinking, she crouched beside him, offering a friendly smile. "Hey, Ethan," she said softly. "That's a cool birthmark you've got there." Ethan beamed. "Yeah. Mom says I was born with it. She says it's special." Emma swallowed hard. She turned to Lily. "You must have been surprised when he was born with it," she said carefully, watching for a reaction. "It's so unique." Lily blinked, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. Then, too quickly, she smiled. "Oh, actually, we didn't notice it right away," she said, her tone light. "It kind of darkened over time." Emma's breath hitched. That wasn't how birthmarks worked. She knew, because Liam's had been there since the day he was born. Something wasn't right. Emma forced herself to nod, offering a polite chuckle as she stood. "Well, he's a lucky kid. Not everyone gets such a cool mark." Lily laughed, ruffling Ethan's hair. "That's what I tell him." Emma said her goodbyes, watching as the family loaded into their car and drove away. She stood frozen in the parking lot long after they were gone, her fingers gripping the camera strap so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew what she had to do. Because deep down, in the pit of her stomach, she knew the truth. She had just taken pictures of a little boy who might not belong to them. And she wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. Unraveling the mystery. Emma sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she watched the empty parking lot where Lily and Nathan had just been. Her heart was pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. She took a shaky breath, trying to reason with herself. Maybe she was overthinking. Maybe she was tired. Maybe the birthmark was just a coincidence. But deep in her gut, she knew the truth. It wasn't just a feeling. It was something more, an instinct clawing at her from the inside, demanding she pay attention. Liam had been gone for 6 years. And Ethan had just turned 6. It wasn't adding up. Emma fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. Her mother's number glared back at her, the name Mom sending a pang of guilt through her chest. For years, their relationship had been strained. After Liam's disappearance, her mother had never been the same. The weight of losing a child, of losing him, had crushed her, and no amount of time had healed the wounds. And Emma, she had blamed herself too. She had carried the guilt like a stone around her neck, day after day, year after year. But now, she had a chance to make it right. She hit dial. The line rang 3 times before a tired voice answered. "Emma?" Her mother sounded hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should be relieved or wary. Emma swallowed hard. "Hey, Mom. I need to ask you something." There was silence on the other end. Then a careful, "What is it?" Emma took a deep breath. "Liam's birthmark," she said. "Do you remember what it looked like?" A sharp inhale. Then, her mother's voice turned cautious. "Why are you asking about that?" Emma hesitated. She knew she couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. If she was wrong, she'd be reopening a wound that had never fully healed. But if she was right... Just humor me, she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. A pause. Then, her mother exhaled, her voice thick with old pain. It was small, shaped like a crescent moon. On his right wrist. Emma's stomach dropped. It was exactly the same as Ethan's. Her mother sighed. I used to kiss it every night before bed, she whispered. Told him it made him special. Emma closed her eyes, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. She couldn't tell her. Not yet. I have to go, she said suddenly. I'll call you later. Before her mother could respond, Emma ended the call. She sat there for a long time, her thoughts racing, her mind spinning. She needed more than just a feeling. She needed proof. Digging deeper. That night, Emma sat in her apartment, her laptop open in front of her. The glow from the screen illuminated her face as she typed into the search bar. Ethan Harrison, birth records. She knew it was a long shot. Official birth records weren't public, but sometimes, small details slipped through the cracks. She scrolled through results, her pulse quickening. Then, she saw it. A birth announcement in an online archive. Ethan Harrison, born September 3, 6 years ago. Emma's heart sank. Liam had been born July 14. The dates didn't match. Her shoulders slumped. Had she really let her emotions get the best of her? Maybe she was wrong. Maybe Ethan wasn't Liam. But then, she saw it. A small line at the bottom of the announcement. Adopted at 3 months old. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Adopted. 3 months old. That meant Ethan hadn't always been Ethan Harrison. She wasn't wrong. Her hands trembled as she clicked deeper into the records. She tried to find out where he had been before the adoption. But there was nothing. It was like his life had started from the moment he was adopted, like the first 3 months of his existence had been wiped away. Emma's pulse raced. Someone had erased his past. And now, she needed to find out why. The confrontation. The next day, Emma sat in her car outside the Harrisons' home. It was a charming, 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, with a red door and a tire swing in the front yard. The perfect picture of a happy, ordinary family. But Emma knew better. Nothing about this was ordinary. She took a deep breath, then stepped out of the car, marching up the driveway. She rang the doorbell. Seconds passed. Then, the door swung open. Lily stood there, surprised. Emma? Emma forced a smile. Hey. Sorry to just drop by, but I had some extra photos I wanted to show you. Lily hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. Oh. Sure, come in. Emma entered, her eyes quickly scanning the house. Everything was normal. Family photos lined the walls, pictures of vacations, birthdays, school events. But when she looked closer, she noticed something. Ethan's baby pictures. Or rather, the lack of them. All of the photos of Ethan started when he was around 4 or 5 months old. Not newborn. Not infant. A knot formed in Emma's stomach. She turned to Lily, her heart pounding. You said Ethan was born with his birthmark, she said carefully. Lily blinked, caught off guard. Yeah? Emma tilted her head. But last night, I found his birth announcement. She kept her voice light, but her hands trembled. It said he was adopted. The color drained from Lily's face. Emma's pulse thundered. She had her answer. And Lily knew something. I don't know what you're talking about, Lily stammered, but her voice shook. Emma stepped closer. Where did you get him, Lily? Silence. Then Nathan appeared in the doorway, his expression tense. Emma, he said, his voice tight. I think it's time for you to leave. Emma's breath hitched. They knew. And now, she was in too deep to turn back. Secrets beneath the surface. A door slammed in her face. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering in her chest as Nathan's eyes locked onto hers. I think it's time for you to leave, he repeated, his voice eerily calm. Lily stood behind him, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale. Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had struck a nerve. They were hiding something big. But if she left now, she might never get another chance to uncover the truth. Emma forced a steady breath. I'm not trying to cause trouble, she said carefully. I just... Nathan cut her off. Emma, go. His tone was firmer this time, more forceful. Emma's hands curled into fists at her sides, frustration boiling inside her. But she knew she couldn't push too hard, not yet. So she did the only thing she could. She nodded, turned on her heel, and walked out the door. The second she stepped onto the porch, she heard it. The lock clicking into place behind her. She turned back, staring at the closed door, her pulse still pounding. They were scared. And scared people made mistakes. Emma walked slowly back to her car, her mind buzzing with possibilities. As she slid into the driver's seat, she pulled out her phone and stared at her screen. Her mother's number was still at the top of her call log. She should tell her. She should go to the police. But without solid proof, she had nothing. She needed more. She needed a way inside. The midnight return. Emma waited until nightfall. She parked her car 2 streets away, the engine off, the cool night air seeping through the cracked window. The Harrisons' house was dark except for a dim light glowing from an upstairs window. She took a deep breath. What she was about to do was crazy. Illegal. But she had no choice. She had spent years haunted by Liam's disappearance. If there was even the slightest chance that Ethan was him, she had to find out the truth. Emma slipped out of the car, her heartbeat thrumming in her ears as she made her way through the shadows. When she reached the backyard, she crouched low behind a bush, scanning the house. Then, she saw it. A basement window. It was small, just above ground level. But it was open. Emma's pulse spiked. She hadn't expected an opportunity this easy. She took one last deep breath, then moved. She crouched low, crawling through the damp grass until she reached the window. Carefully, she pushed it up the rest of the way, holding her breath as it creaked softly. Then, she slid her legs through and dropped down into the darkness. The room of shadows. The basement smelled like dust and old wood. Moonlight spilled in through the window, casting faint silver streaks across the room. Emma moved carefully, her fingers grazing against the walls, feeling for a light switch. Her hand found one. She hesitated. If she turned it on, someone might notice. But she needed to see. Taking the risk, she flicked it. A dim, flickering light illuminated the space. And then... Emma's breath caught in her throat. The basement was filled with boxes. Old, worn-out boxes, stacked in neat rows. Her stomach twisted. There was something unsettling about them, like they were filled with things that were meant to be forgotten. She stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached for the nearest box. It was labeled in black marker. Emma's heart nearly stopped. It said, Ethan's past. She swallowed hard, then carefully pried it open. Inside were documents, photographs, and a small blue baby blanket. Emma's fingers trembled as she picked up the first piece of paper. It was a hospital discharge form. Her eyes scanned the text, her breath catching at a familiar name. Not Ethan Harrison. Not the name they had given him. But his real name. Liam Carter. Emma's knees nearly buckled. It was him. It was really, really him. Tears burned behind her eyes as she stared at the paper, her vision blurring. All these years. All these years of grief, pain, and loss. And he had been alive. Right in front of her. A sob almost escaped her lips, but she bit it back. She wasn't safe yet. She needed to get out. She shoved the paper into her jacket pocket, turned. And froze. Because standing at the top of the basement stairs was Nathan. And in his hand was a gun. Trapped. Emma's blood ran cold. Nathan's face was calm, but his grip on the gun was tight. "You shouldn't be here, Emma," he said quietly. Emma's mouth went dry. Her mind raced. She had to think, fast. She forced a shaky breath. "You stole him," she whispered. "You stole Liam." Nathan's jaw clenched. "We saved him." Emma's stomach twisted. "Saved him," she echoed. "From what? His real family?" Nathan exhaled sharply, his hand tightening around the gun. "You don't understand." Emma felt her pulse thundering. "Then make me understand," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Tell me why you took him." Nathan hesitated. Then Lily appeared behind him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. "Nathan, stop." He didn't move. Lily stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "She already knows," she whispered. "We can't hide it anymore." Nathan's hand trembled. For a moment, Emma thought he might pull the trigger. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Lily turned to her, her eyes filled with pain. "There's something you don't know," she whispered. Emma swallowed hard. "What?" Lily hesitated, glancing at Nathan. Then, she said the words that made Emma's blood run cold. "We didn't steal him," she whispered. "Someone else did. And we were the ones who found him." Emma's heart stopped. "What?" Lily swallowed hard. "We're not the villains here, Emma," she said softly. "But the people who took him? They're still out there." Emma felt the world tilt beneath her feet. It wasn't over. Not even close. The real monsters in the dark. A truth worse than she expected. Emma stood in the dimly lit basement, her breath shallow, her mind spinning. "We didn't steal him," Lily had just said. "Someone else did. And we were the ones who found him." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. If they didn't take Liam, then who did? She forced herself to speak. "You expect me to believe that?" she whispered. Nathan let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his face. "I know how it looks," he admitted. "But we didn't kidnap Ethan, Liam." Emma clenched her jaw. "Then tell me everything." Lily and Nathan exchanged a look, an unspoken conversation passing between them. Then, Lily turned back to Emma, her voice trembling. "We found him 5 years ago," she whispered. "Wandering on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere." Emma's breath caught. He was alone. Her stomach twisted. "Where?" Nathan exhaled. "Near an abandoned house in the next town over." Emma's hands clenched into fists. "That doesn't make sense," she said, her voice shaking. "Liam wasn't just lost, he was taken. Someone kidnapped him from my sister's backyard, in broad daylight. He couldn't have just escaped." Nathan's expression darkened. "We don't think he escaped." Emma's blood ran cold. Lily swallowed hard. Emma, she whispered, we think someone dumped him there. Emma's breath hitched. She felt like the floor was tilting beneath her. Dumped? Like trash? No. No, it couldn't be. Tears burned behind her eyes. Who would do that? She whispered. Lily hesitated. Nathan turned and grabbed something from the box Emma had just opened. A photo. He held it out. Emma took it with shaking hands and stared at the faded image. At first, she couldn't process what she was looking at. Then, her entire body went cold. It was a picture of Liam. But he was different. His cheeks were hollow, his skin pale. And his eyes. They weren't the bright, happy eyes of the little boy she remembered. They were empty. Emma's stomach twisted. When was this taken? She choked out. Lily hesitated. The day we found him. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, bile rising in her throat. Her nephew had been missing for years, and when he finally turned up, he had been broken. Someone had done this to him. And they were still out there. The missing years. Emma forced herself to breathe. What else do you know? She demanded. Nathan hesitated, then gestured for her to follow. She did. They climbed the basement stairs, moving through the silent house. Then, Nathan pushed open a door. Ethan's room. Emma's heart clenched as she stepped inside. The room was normal. A bed. Posters on the walls. A pile of books in the corner. But there was one thing that made her breath hitch. A small wooden box on the nightstand. Liam used to have one just like it. With trembling hands, she picked it up and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were little scraps of paper, folded neatly. Her throat tightened. Carefully, she unfolded one and read the shaky handwriting. They told me my name is Ethan. Emma's chest tightened. She picked up another note. I don't remember what my real family looks like, but I think I had a sister. Tears blurred her vision. Another note. They said if I talked, I'd never see daylight again. Emma sucked in a breath. She squeezed the note in her fist, her hands shaking. Her nephew had been tortured. Manipulated. Trapped. And whoever took him had made sure he would never speak of it. She turned to Lily and Nathan, her voice raw. What else do you know? Lily hesitated, then sat on the edge of the bed. There was something odd about where we found him, she said softly. Emma wiped her tears and focused. What do you mean? Nathan ran a hand through his hair. The house, he muttered. The abandoned house near where we found him. It wasn't just empty. Emma's breath caught. Lily's hands trembled. There were old chains in the basement, she whispered. A chill ran down Emma's spine. Chains. Her mind spun. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was something worse. Something sickening. She turned to Nathan. Did you tell the police? His face darkened. We tried, he said. But by the time they checked, the house was burned to the ground. Emma's blood turned ice cold. Someone was covering their tracks. And they had been watching. She suddenly felt exposed, like eyes were on her right now. She had to act fast. She turned to Nathan and Lily, her voice urgent. Tell me exactly where you found him. Nathan hesitated. Then he sighed. 47 Hollow Creek Road. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew that address. She had seen it before. In old police reports. It was the home of a man who had once been investigated for child trafficking. But he had never been charged. And he was still out there. The danger ahead. Emma didn't sleep that night. She sat in her car outside the Harrison house, staring at the police report she had pulled up on her phone. 47 Hollow Creek Road had been owned by a man named Daniel Crowley. A man who had been suspected of running a network of child kidnappers. But no one had ever been able to prove anything. Now, Emma had proof. Liam had been there. And if he had been one of Crowley's victims, there could be others. A wave of determination surged through her. She wasn't stopping. She was going to find out everything. And she was going to make sure the people who hurt Liam paid. Even if it meant putting herself in danger. Even if it meant facing the real monsters in the dark. Emma put her car in gear. She was going to Hollow Creek Road. And she wasn't leaving until she found the truth. The shadows of Hollow Creek. A drive into darkness. Emma gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The road ahead was dark, twisting through dense trees that seemed to close in around her. The GPS flickered as she neared the coordinates, 47 Hollow Creek Road. Her mind raced. Someone had taken Liam. Someone had kept him there. And whoever had done this was still out there. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but she had no choice. She had to see it for herself. As she pulled onto the cracked, overgrown driveway, a wave of unease crawled up her spine. The house was long gone, burned to the ground years ago, but the land remained untouched. A ghost of its former horrors. Emma parked her car, heart pounding. She stepped out into the cold night air, her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. Snap! She froze. A twig had just cracked nearby. Her fingers tightened around the flashlight. She wasn't alone. Uncovering the truth. Forcing herself to move, she stepped forward, her boots crunching against the dried leaves. The place where the house had once stood was a charred ruin. All that remained was the concrete foundation, cracked and filled with weeds. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps. She stepped carefully, scanning the ground. And then she saw it. A trapdoor, barely visible beneath a pile of dead leaves. Her stomach clenched. A basement. She knelt, brushing the leaves away, revealing rusted hinges and a heavy iron handle. It looked ancient, and sealed shut. Who would burn down a house but leave the basement intact? She gritted her teeth and pulled. The door groaned as it creaked open, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. A ladder led down into the abyss. Emma swallowed hard. She flicked on her flashlight and descended into the unknown. A nightmare beneath the ground. The air was thick and suffocating, filled with the scent of damp earth and something else, something rotten. Emma's light swept across the space. Her stomach lurched. The basement wasn't empty. Scattered across the floor were small, rusted chains. Children's clothes. And against the far wall, a row of old, wooden cages. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might pass out. She stepped closer, her breath shaky. These weren't just storage cages. They were prison cells. Emma clapped a hand over her mouth, bile rising in her throat. This was where they had kept Liam. And maybe, others. Tears burned in her eyes as she scanned the walls, desperate for any clue. Any name, any piece of evidence that could lead to the people behind this horror. That's when she saw it. A name scratched into the cement. A name she recognized. D. Crowley. Her blood ran cold. Daniel Crowley. The man who had owned this house. The man who had been suspected of running a child trafficking ring. Emma's hands shook. This was the proof she needed. She needed to call the police, right now. She reached for her phone. Bang! The sound of a gunshot echoed through the basement. The hunter becomes the hunted. Emma froze, her heart nearly stopping in her chest. Then. Footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Coming down the ladder. Someone was here. Her mind spun. She barely had time to react before the figure reached the bottom. A man. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Wearing dark clothes and a mask over his face. In his hand, a gun. Emma's breath hitched. She recognized him. Even with the mask, she knew. She had seen his picture in the files. Daniel Crowley. He wasn't gone. He was still watching. Still hunting. And now, she was his next target. The chase begins. Emma's survival instincts kicked in. She whipped around, running toward the ladder, but Crowley was faster. Bang! A bullet whizzed past her ear, hitting the wall inches from her face. She dived behind a pile of debris, her breath coming in ragged gasps. You shouldn't have come here, Crowley's voice growled. You should have left the past buried. Emma's heart pounded. She reached into her pocket, fumbling for her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed 911, pressing the speaker button. Before she could speak, Crowley lunged. She screamed, twisting away. But he grabbed her by the throat, slamming her against the cold, damp wall. The phone clattered to the ground, the operator's voice faintly calling, 911, what's your emergency? Crowley pressed the gun to her temple. This is what happens, he hissed, when you dig too deep. Emma's mind raced. She couldn't die here. Not now. Not before she made sure he paid for what he did to Liam. Her fingers brushed against something. A metal pipe. She grabbed it and swung. Crack. The pipe slammed into Crowley's skull. He staggered, cursing. Emma didn't wait. She ran. A race against time. She scrambled up the ladder, her muscles screaming. Behind her, Crowley was recovering, footsteps pounding as he gave chase. Emma reached the surface, bursting out of the trapdoor. She ran for her car. But her tires were slashed. Her stomach dropped. Crowley had planned for this. Panic surged, but she forced herself to think. The road. She had to make it to the road. Help, she screamed into the night. Somebody help me. Then, headlights. A car. Coming down the road fast. Emma waved her arms frantically. The car screeched to a stop. Nathan jumped out, gun in hand. Emma? She barely had time to respond before Crowley appeared, gun raised. Nathan fired first. The bullet hit Crowley in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground. Emma gasped for breath, her entire body shaking. Nathan rushed to her side. Are you okay? Emma couldn't speak. She turned back to where Crowley had fallen. But he was gone. Blood dripped in the dirt. But the monster had vanished into the night. Justice. Or revenge? The police arrived minutes later. They searched the woods, the abandoned basement, but Crowley was nowhere to be found. Emma knew one thing. This wasn't over. She had proof now. The truth was out. And she was going to make sure Crowley paid, no matter what it took. Liam had been silenced once. But Emma? She wasn't stopping until every monster like Crowley was buried for good.